Good afternoon. I did not know that there is a bonus in delivering the Centennial lecture. But I did not expect that it would be a way of listening to my obituary. Thank you for that kindness, Dean Leonen and Professor Batong Bagal. Your Excellencies, honored guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen. May I go through the outline, which should not be mistaken for the lecture. And when you go through the outline, I think it might be necessary to begin with asking your patience. I begin with some distinctions from the viewpoint of the Constitution as it defines sovereignty. And when I made some survey, it would be important to emphasize that the concept of sovereignty as we know it, drawn by our legal scholars, came from an entirely different historical context. And perhaps without our consciousness, there might be some distinction in terms of substantive content of sovereignty as we know it as a legal concept from sovereignty in the historical experience of our people. Then we have a survey on the state formation in Southeast Asia before the European intervention. And I have some notes on the sultanates of Maguindanao and Sulu. Please. I dealt with Spanish colonialism, but I abbreviated it to the consequences and implications of the Spanish rule. But here it is to emphasize that there is sovereignty, but the Filipino people was an object of sovereignty and a concept that was alienated from them. Later on, I gave some points with respect to the implications and consequences of Spanish colonialism. And surprisingly, perhaps on your part, I would deal with some of the positive contribution of Spanish colonialism with respect to state formation in the Philippines. Please. I made some notes on the state formation under the aegis of the Philippine Revolution, and it presents the question as to whether there was statehood on the part of the Philippine revolutionary government. But if there is any flaw and if there is any extirpation of the formation of sovereignty, we owe it to U.S. imperialism. And I will explain some of the points which have not been surveyed before. Please. Then we have some peculiar points with respect to the relationship of the Americans and the Philippine Revolutionary Forces, which would deal with, I should say, deception on the part of the United States government. And may I mention in advance one point, that in the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris, the Philippine Revolutionary Forces were treated by the Spanish and American commissioners in Paris as auxiliary force of the United States Military Command. And therefore, the lands that the Philippine revolutionaries were occupying where therefore they were occupying in behalf of the U.S. military command as a consequence. And then there was the curiosity with respect to the capitulation by the Spanish forces, which amounted to a mock battle between the Americans and the Spanish forces with the intention to preclude the Filipino revolutionary forces to participate in the occupation of Intramuros, which was of strategic importance because it was the seat of the Spanish colonial rule. Please. Then we begin with the era of U.S. sovereignty over the islands. We deal with the colonial division of labor under U.S. sovereignty to show some points that we'll develop later. And we deal with Philippine independence, but it is an independence regulated and controlled by U.S. federal law. In particular, we will examine concretely the Tidings-McDuffie law, how it regulated Philippine independence ahead of its time. Please. Then we deal with some peculiarities arising from the text of the Truman's Proclamation of Independence. And the proclamation itself contains some reservations which is not easy to define because it refers to the reservations that are in pursuant to the U.S. statutes, and we would know what are the U.S. statutes on the basis of which we have the definition of conditions for Philippine independence. Then a turning point in the development of our national economy, the transformation of the Philippine economy from its colonial division of labor into export industrialization. What is to be emphasized here is that while we may consider it as a turning point in our economic development, it did not certainly originate from the wisdom of our political leaders. And of course, these are engineered by external forces, as I will discuss more concretely later on. Then, it's not well known that the Philippine economy has become the industrial sector of Japan. And when I speak of satellisation, I mean it deliberately, that the Philippine economy has become a satellite in the industrial system of Japan. Japan transferring labor-intensive manufacturing. And you will therefore see the wisdom on the part of the Japanese in insisting the ratification on the part of the Philippines of Japan-Philippines Economic Partnership Agreement, or JPEPA. And here we have the installation of free trade for the reason that the benefits of the free trade relations would be on the part of the labor-intensive manufacturing of the part of Japan in the Philippines, with the products going to be exported to Japan. And it will illustrate really how, in very concrete terms, the Philippines has become the industrial sector of the Japanese economy. And I think you must have heard of Calabarzon project, but it was installed by the master plan of JECA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, and it was officially received by the Philippines, and it is being developed by Japanese funding. And the challenge is with respect to the question, why should we devote a centennial lecture on the founding of the UP College of Law anniversary with all the negative points that we have explained? And so we have a note at the end of what is the challenge. So may I come back to the first part of the outline on preface to sovereignty. The making of the nation's fundamental law is an act of the people. I'm not sure that many people know this. The preamble of the Constitution records the fact that it is, quote, "we, the sovereign Filipino people, who ordained and promulgated it. We know that we are the people. But when the problem arises as to what are we as a sovereign people, or are we a sovereign people, the bewilderment begins. The problem deepens when we go on further with the constitutional text. Section 2, Article 2 is familiar to law students. It reads, "Sovereignty resides in the people, and all government authority emanates from them," unquote. On the gray assumption that they understand what sovereignty is, are they conscious that they are the embodiment of sovereignty? At this point, may I recall, since Professor Sison is here, may I recall an incident in the popularization of the law seminar sponsored by the UP Law Faculty in Palawan some years ago. And Professor Sison lectured on the Constitution, and of course with emphasis on the point that sovereignty resides in the people. During the open forum, what I thought was the oldest barangay kapitan raised his hand and stood up and raised the following question addressed to Professor Sison, our expert on constitutional law. And the barangay kapitan said, it's more colorful if I quote him in Filipino. "Ginoong Profesor," he said, "kung kami para ang kumakatawan sa soberanidad ng bayan, bakit hindi namin alam?" I thought that's the most dramatic presentation of constitutionalism I've ever heard. If the constitutional text pertains to the people in their actual social conditions, plagued by poverty in the fullness of its consequences, victimized by economic exploitation, and without understanding of their political role, how meaningful is the constitutional reference to them as a force of sovereignty? The Constitution then may be in a deep predicament of being involved in a mythical people and a mythical sovereignty. The way out of the enigma is to strike a distinction between sovereignty as a legal concept formulated on a high level of abstraction on one hand, and sovereignty as a historical experience of the people on the other hand. I suspect that the concept of sovereignty as embodied in the constitutional text is drawn from the intellectual orientation of Filipino legal scholars whose mindset is naturally forged by Western paradigms out of sources from particular historical periods. This approach seems to be reflected in history books on the Philippines examined critically by Eleto in his studies published in his monograph, Knowing America's Colony, 100 years from the Philippine War. Unfortunately, Eleto did not give us the benefit of his own methodology, which may have been, I suspect, a study of Philippine developments based on specificity of forces internal to the Filipino nation. In legal studies especially, the formation and content of the concept of sovereignty are derived from U.S. jurisprudence. It reminds me that in the Tidings-McDuffie law, there is a provision that the decisions of Philippine courts are subject to review by the U.S. Supreme Court. But let me relate this to the fact that our courts have the established habit of deriving points of law and points of justice from U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And I thought that there might be little difference from the Tidings-McDuffie law and the present practice of our courts. But these are maybe further ramifications of the regulation of Philippine independence by U.S. law. In legal studies especially, the formulation and content of the concept of sovereignty are derived from U.S. jurisprudence, including the development of constitutionalism from legal history, as well as the background to the emergence of the modern state out of absolute monarchy as the highest stage of feudalism. State formation in Southeast Asia in centuries before the advent of European colonial rule did not develop from identical circumstances, and the historical basis of sovereignty as internal to the experience of the people in the region was qualitatively different. Feudalism, for example, which was the historic base in the development of the theory of sovereignty in Western context, was nowhere in importance in the economic and political context in state formation in Java, Sumatra, Malacca, or Johor, or in the Srivijaya and Majapahit empires. Remarkably, it was by the royal sovereignty of Spanish colonialism that implanted feudal structures in the Philippines during the colonial rule. Explaining sovereignty in its European context, Lasky observes, and I quote him, "The territorial and omnipotent state is the offspring of religious struggles in the 16th century in the clash between the Pope and the Emperor. In Southeast Asia context, the Srivijaya and Majapahit empires, the super-state in their own time, were temple-building civilizations, as indicated by Borobudur and Angkor Wat, in which the kings and sultans devoted the exercise of sovereign authority in the cause of Hinduism and Buddhism. The case of the sultanates in Sulu and Maguindanao, Islam was integrated into the sovereign authority of the sultan. In the West, royal power heightened its supremacy over baronial class by alliance with the emergent merchant class. But in Southeast Asian context, states at the time, kings and sultans directly controlled the market and derived their wealth from the monopoly over commerce and trade. Let me make a survey of Southeast Asian state formation before the intervention of European colonialism. From the vantage point of centuries before the European conquest, what are now the constituent islands of the Philippines were not clearly treated as one archipelagic territorial unit. There is hardly any reference to these islands as constituting an archipelago. The settlements in and around Manila were called Luzon. Reed describes the Manila settlements as a federation under Raja Sulaiman, a federation, and the island of Mai or Mindoro was a trading center by itself, which was singled out in its importance due to its being influenced by the Srivisayan and Majapahit empires. The island of Mindoro was a trading center which came under the influence of the Srivisaya and later of the Majapahit Empire. Dato Puti, apparently as chief counselor of the ruler of Brunei, led the establishment of a settlement in the island of Panay with 10 datos following negotiations with Dato Maricudo. Dato Puti sailed onward to Lake Taal, where he completed another settlement before returning to Borneo. Some of the Taal settlers later on moved to Bicol, and 5 other places settlements were established in Western Negros. In the wake of the collapse of the Majapahit Empire, Elito observes that Islamic kingdoms blossomed in the archipelago. Maguindanao and Sulu developed into full-fledged sultanates with supreme authority over the territory and population within their claimed geographic limits. Reed characterizes Maguindanao as, to quote him, the strongest indigenous state in Philippine history, which began to consolidate along the Polanque River in Mindanao in the late 16th century. The sultans of Sulu at the time considered themselves as heads of state over and above the petty datos. The state formation through sultanates in Maguindanao and Sulu was influenced by the developments generated by the Srivisaya and Majapahit civilizations. Bayer informs us that Srivisaya's influence extended by founding colonies, and it must have been the practice of the leadership of the two civilizations to establish colonies in various parts of Southeast Asia, extending up to the Philippine archipelago. And as one of the colonies, Bayer takes note that at the end of the 10th century, Bidarmasin, one of the kingdoms within the Srivisayan Empire, was among those of importance vis-a-vis the Philippines. As Bayer reports, and I quote him, turning now to a more specific consideration of Srivisayan influence in the Philippines, we find evidence of more trustworthy character. The areas chiefly affected are 2, Sulu, which was colonized from Banjarmasin, and West Central Philippines, which was colonized from Brunei. And so the settlements that became kingdoms and sultanates in the various islands of the archipelago must have been established as colonies by these two civilizations. During the period 1663 to 1718, when Spanish presence was withdrawn from Mindanao, De la Costa is of the view that to quote him, during the 50 years and more of Spain's withdrawal from the south, the Magindanaos and Zulus had made considerable advances in the direction of centralized government. He described this as having, to quote him, fiscal administration, courts of justice, and a bureaucracy of a rudimentary kind, unquote. In a more concrete historical frame, Salibi's assessment at the beginning of the 20th century gives an overview of the sovereign authority of the Maguindanao Sultanate. And I quote him, "In the fullness of his glory, the Sultan of Maguindanao ruled over the whole southern coast of Mindanao, from Powent to Gobom, east of Mali to Zamboanga, and beyond this latter point to the outskirts of Dapitan, all the pagan tribes living around the Gulf of Davao and the Sarangani country, and all the Sabanos west of Tucuran and Dapitan submitted to his power and paid him tribute. In the upper Rio Grande Valley, the power of the Reyes of Buayan was felt and respected as far as the watershed of the Cagayan Valley on the north and the inaccessible slopes of Mount Apo on the east," unquote. The rest of the settlements in central and northern part of the islands must have developed into petty sultanate leadership. But of course, all these transformations toward political organization under the sovereign authority of the sultans and chieftains disintegrated under the impact of Spanish colonialism. Far from the historical context generalized in textbooks on westernized concept of sovereignty, sovereignty as a historical experience of the people in their own leadership, developed from the internal dictates of their social life, including the elements of independence from external interference and effectiveness of their own social norm until they were subjugated by the European colonizers. Let me, in abbreviated form, summarize the impact of the Spanish royal sovereignty. By the nature of colonialism, the sovereignty of the Crown of Spain operated in totalizing impact on the Filipino people in terms of economic exploitation, moral and social cleansing, which was not well known, and political oppression, in which the people became merely the object of sovereignty alienated from them. In the course of 300 years, Spanish colonialism at the same time succeeded in laying down the conditions of its downfall. These conditions may be summarized as follows. 1, it organized the whole archipelago into a centralized political organization, installing an administrative apparatus down to local governance, setting up the facilities of the future statehood of the Filipino people. Number 2, it generated a unifying consciousness on the part of the people of a national community, and it was as a Filipino people that the supreme authority of the Spanish royalty subjugated them in oppression and exploitation. Number 3, the transformation of the population of Las Islas Filipinas into a collective social force of national consciousness or nationalism. And lastly, it consolidated over time the mass protest and discontent of the people in sporadic uprisings into conditions that ripened into the Revolution of 1896. I now share with you some notes on the Philippine Revolution of 1896 and the problem of statehood. Did the Philippine Revolution of 1896 succeed in establishing statehood together with the exercise of sovereign authority? At the time, the Filipino forces had already liberated the greater part of the archipelago from Spanish forces and placed Manila under siege. In a memorandum of 27 August 1898 on the Philippine situation, days following the establishment of the U.S. military government in the Philippines, General Greene of the U.S. Expeditionary Forces wrote, I quote him, "The Spanish power is dead beyond the possibility of resurrection, and Spain would be unable to govern these islands if we surrender them," unquote. Aguinaldo established a dictatorial government on 24 May 1898, and on 23 June 1898, he became president of the revolutionary government, following his proclamation of independence of the Philippines on 12 June 1898. But the main forces of the Americans began landing on 30 June 1898, and the U.S. established its military government in the Philippines on 14 August 1898, on the same day that the United States and Spain signed the final act of capitulation of Manila. The Aguinaldo government achieved significant steps in the formal installation of the Philippine Republic with the proclamation of the Constitution on 21 January 1899. The Republic was inaugurated, in fact, 2 days later. All these were revolutionary acts of a revolutionary government. It managed to a significant extent in building institutions of statehood and facilities for supreme authority. However, it was yet in the formal process of extending governmental authority to faraway provinces in terms of external relations that would have generated independence. U.S. imperialism nullified the elements of independence. Following the establishment of the military government by the United States, the U.S. forces effectively prevented the Filipino troops from participating in the occupation of Manila, the capital of the capital city, which was still in the hands of the Spanish forces. 2 acts of unequal deception were committed by the United States government at this point. Firstly, in terminating the hostilities with the Spanish forces, especially in the capture of the capital city, it shut off the historic victory of the Philippine Revolution over Spain, the liberation of the people from 300 years of colonial rule. At the time, it appears that the attack of Intramuros by the surrounding 12,000 Filipino troops was assured of victory in the seizure of the seat of colonial government. The capitulation by the Spanish authorities came on 13 August 1898, after the staging of a mock battle, secretly agreed by the American and Spanish forces. The French consul in Manila, G.D. Bernard, observed in his letter of 15 August 1898 to his foreign minister in Paris that, to quote his letter, this capitulation after only 3/4 of an hour of firing at the advanced post of the Spaniards leads to the suspicion that everything was prearranged, unquote. Apparently, this subterfuge was intended for a swift turnover of power to bar the Filipino revolutionary forces from any significant role in the capture of the seat of colonial government in Intramuros. The mock battle was staged not only as a face-saving measure for the Spaniards, but of strategic importance to the two powers as a measure to legitimize the settlement of peace between them to the exclusion of the Filipino revolutionary forces. Secondly, the United States government engaged in the pretension that, as reported to Washington by General Greene, commander of the American volunteers, and I quote him, the United States government, through its naval commander, he was referring to Dewey, has to some extent made use of them, referring to Filipino revolutionary forces, for a distinct military purpose, that is to harass and annoy the Spanish troops, to wear them out in the trenches, to block Manila on the land side, and to do as much damage as much as possible to the Spanish government prior to the arrival of our troops. And for this purpose, the Admiral allowed them to take arms and munitions and their ships to pass in and out of Manila. But the Admiral has been very careful to give Aguinaldo no assurances of recognition and no pledges or promises of any description, unquote. In the course of diplomatic negotiations between the United States, between the U.S. and Spanish commissioners, that finalized the conclusion of the Treaty of Paris of 10 December 1898, the Spanish side submitted a statement that described the Filipino revolutionary forces as, and I quote the Spanish statement, the Tagalog rebels who formed during the campaign an auxiliary force to the regular American troops, unquote. There appears to be no disclaimer from the U.S. side. This signifies that as auxiliary force of the U.S. military command, the areas occupied by the Filipino troops were regarded as within the control of the U.S. military command, which exercised responsibility over their military operations. These two factors imply that, in effect, the United States government wiped out the historical role of the Philippine Revolutionary Forces in the expulsion and defeat of the Spanish colonial regime. How would the Philippine Republic or the revolutionary government be treated in recognition of its statehood or international personality at the time? Here, the dice was loaded in the interest of both the United States and Spain. Reflecting the international law of the time, the Permanent Court of International Justice rendered judgment in the Eastern Greenland case. Its statement on the implication of the downfall of the early Norwegian settlements in Greenland as a result of resistance by the native Eskimos may be instructive. The court said, and I quote, "Conquest only operates as a cause of the loss of sovereignty where there is a war between two states, and by reason of the defeat of one of them, sovereignty over the territory passed from the loser to the victorious state. The principle does not apply in the case where a settlement has been established in distant country and its inhabitants are massacred by the aboriginal population, unquote. This view means that the Eskimo victory could not affect Norway's effective occupation and never gave the Eskimos capacity to acquire territorial sovereignty over eastern Greenland, as against the Norwegian claim over the same territory. The Eskimos did not have the recognition as a state, and so they could not have legitimately gone to war in the legal sense. Even as the Eskimos exterminated all the early Norwegian settlers occupying their lands, international law at the time told them that they were not engaged in conquest, nor are they at war as a state. And therefore, international law does not give them sovereign right over the disputed territory. Hence, the experience of the Philippine community proclaimed by the Philippine Revolution was given the Eskimo treatment. And thus, sovereignty could not be passed on to the Filipino people. I think the colonial division of labor is familiar to many. And I would like to skip this, but just to abbreviate this in terms of some figures to show the total dependency of the Philippine Islands to the U.S. economy. Of course, we are familiar with the sugar-coated imperialism that was dished out by U.S. President William McKinley, and I trust that you might be interested in the background of this. As you know, following the annexation by the United States, the Philippines was turned into one of the biggest producers in the world of sugar. And in regard to the sugar industry, the so-called forces of history was personified in the American Sugar Company, American Sugar Refining Company, and a decisive influence on U.S., which had a decisive influence on U.S. President McKinley in the annexation of the Philippines, the sixth largest U.S. corporation in control of 99% of the sugar refining industry in the United States at the time. McKinley was its strongest supporter in the U.S. Senate, and following his election on the to the U.S. presidency in 1896, the God-given inspiration that impelled him to annex the Philippines must have been so irresistibly sugar-coated that overnight he decided, to quote him in his declaration, to put the Philippines on the map of the United States, unquote. The other classical function of the colony was actualized in the Philippines. The free trade relations imposed on the country transformed it into an almost exclusive market for U.S. manufacturers. By 1933, the Philippine imports from the United States or manufactured goods increased to 64%. And it came into 65% in 1920. The conditions of economic backwardness generated by the colonial division of labor, by the nature of things, have maintained their continuity far into the decades of the country's independence. Demands for industrialization are left unfulfilled, and today the Philippines stands without an industrial base. As in the past, it remained in utter dependence on the United States on the eve of political independence. Referring to the Philippine situation as to the dependency of the Philippines, you might be interested in how bewaring the situation of dependency on the part of the Philippines, Manuel Luis Quezon anticipated the inevitable. In his autobiography, he said, "I fought the measure upon the ground that free trade relations between our countries would result in making the Philippines absolutely dependent upon the markets of the United States. Thus, I contended," Quezon said, this would create a most serious situation in the Philippine economic life, especially at the time for the granting of independence," unquote. But on his side, Paul McNutt, at the time the High Commissioner of the United States to the Philippines, appointed by the U.S. President, and representing the U.S. President in the Philippine Commonwealth, had the following statement to justify the Philippine dependency. He said, and I quote him, "When you say trade in the Philippines, you mean the national economy. It is a trading economy, and I might and should say here and now that we, the United States, manage it that way. We are responsible for the sole dependence of the Philippines on the American market. Our businessmen and statesmen," that includes him, "in past years allowed the Philippines to become a complete economic dependency of the United States to a greater degree than any single state of the Union is economically dependent on the rest of the United States."